Education, as I understand it, really has to do more with drawing forth what's already here, as opposed to putting stuff in. And you can put in all sorts of things, and if you're not careful, it's a little bit like an immunization model of education, where you immunize kids against history, and then they don't want to hear any more history. You immunize them against science, and then they don't want to hear any more science. You inject a little mathematics, and then everybody's scared of algebra or geometry. So you have a bunch of adults that don't want to go anywhere near these disciplines that are actually incredibly beautiful, but they have to be infused with a certain relationality from the beginning, so that learning becomes an adventure. And it's grounded in the body. We're so disembodied in the society that often the body doesn't get any attention, or it just becomes its own separate discipline. Now we're going to do the biology of the body. But it's not the body, it's like your body. And so how can we actually feel it and experience it from the inside? So just focusing, for instance, on breathing. Instead of being like, oh, breathing. I mean, what's so interesting about breathing? Well, the entire universe is actually inside one breath, and how we can relate to that. And time stops when we drop into the breath. And sometimes it's very valuable when things are going by very fast to know that it's possible to slow things down. So there are 1,000 different ways in which, if we learn to tune this incredible instrument that we have by virtue of being human, and we learn to train it so that we know how to use the mind and how not to get caught in the mind's own turbulence, the mind's own destructive impulses, the mind's fear, for instance, or deep sadness leading to depression, or anger. These are naturally occurring mental states. But if we don't know anything about them, and we haven't learned anything about them, except by watching other people lose their minds, often in our own families, then we're almost guaranteed to fall into reactive emotional patterns in a very similar way, or in very different reactive ways, because we don't want to do what our parents did, but we wind up doing something else, as opposed to learning how to accept this as the kind of natural landscape of the mind. Part of the territory is that we have all these different mind states, but if we learn how to navigate them, then we don't have to be their prisoners. We don't have to be at the mercy of them. What blows my mind, what's most exciting to me to walk into these classrooms, is to see kids actually learning how to be very quiet, how to really listen, and to actually attend to very, very faint trailing sound before they raise their hand. You're asking them to raise their hand when they can't hear something anymore. So it requires a very beautiful relationship to the present moment. Am I hearing sound or not? Too much thinking, you won't even hear it at all. So can I drop underneath thought and just hear it? So it's paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And that non-judgmental part means that all of the ideas and opinions and self-statements that we have about ourselves, I'm too this, I'm not enough that, blah, 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 that we also see those as thoughts. It creates greater self-confidence, greater emotional balance, greater emotional intelligence, so to speak. The kids have it all already, but if it's not in some sense pointed out to them and held and shaped and a container supplied for it, and then right through all of the various years of schooling, it's so easily lost and so easily occluded by all of the learning that has to happen, outward learning. But without the inner, the outer is of limited value. So especially with the degree of stress kids are under nowadays, learning to cultivate intimacy with the interiority of one's own being, with the inner landscape, with the possibility for inner resilience in the face of lots of stressful circumstances in one's life situation, even in the school, in the neighborhood, and so forth. It's not a luxury, it's an absolute core necessity if these kids are going to come to adulthood with a kind of a robust sense of well-being, clarity, confidence in themselves, and the ability to form relationships that really are life-serving and life-giving. We're, in some sense, reminding kids, and I like to say also rebodying kids, about what it means to be human. And it's it has to do with being. So rather than just trying to accomplish things or get what you don't have or push away what you don't want, you're learning how to, in some sense, be with the unfolding of one's life. It turns out there's a huge amount of energy associated with that and clarity, so that you can make choices that you can't make when you're basically running on autopilot and blasting through your moments to get the better moments, or running away from all the things that you're having trouble with. Now, of course, it has to be taught in an age-appropriate way, so that you're not, sort of teaching 6-year-olds stuff that 12-year-olds couldn't even understand, because we also teach this to adults, where these emotional issues become very, very powerful. But you can, I think, introduce it appropriately all the way along. There are teachers developing mindfulness-based curriculums all around the country. Why? Because they're at their wits' end. It's just not working in the classroom, and it's not satisfying, and teachers are leaving the profession, and they are just completely stressed out and so forth. How do we bring this into it? And a lot of it doesn't cost much. I mean, being doesn't cost a lot, What it requires is a certain kind of attunement to the actuality of one's experience, and a kind of trust that your experience is valid. Now, a lot of these kids, they may never have had the experience of having their direct moment-to-moment experience validated, to be seen for who they are in some way and say, you know what, you're okay the way you are. You don't need to have one more thing have to happen to you, or know one more thing to be okay in this moment. And that what learning is really about is a gigantic adventure. I mean, the possibilities are infinite. And if you can find what it is that you love, and then let that love be your pathway, and let it follow it where it goes, that's what the world most needs from you, and that's, in some sense, the path to true happiness. Now, and here are some tools you might need along the way. One is this kind of fine-tuning, regulation. I mean, there are many, many neuroscientists now getting into studying the effects of mindfulness on children, and showing it has effects on, working memory, that it has effects on, as you were saying, impulse control, what's called executive functioning or executive control, with prefrontal cortical areas of the brain, which are being developed, at an amazing rate in different stages in a child's life, but right up into adulthood, and that they are particularly sensitive to stress at areas of brain growth, during times of brain growth. And so if we can create environments where they know you can't create a stress-free environment, but if you can give them tools so that they could self-regulate and reduce the effects of that stress on their bodies and on their brains and on their emotional reactivity, that would be a huge, huge gift to them. And then the learning of subjects, whatever the subjects were, that would come so much more easily, because you've actually created the conditions where you want to learn, because it's fun, because it's, there's some kind of relationality there that is opening, that is nurturing something within myself. Ultimately, I think that's love. That's what we call it. We call it love of learning. And what we would like is for education to not kill the love of learning, which is natural in children when they're little, and maybe by the time they get out of high school or whatever, immunized against to a large degree. So rather than that, maybe we could just turn things around. I think the potential for this is enormous, and I think that we have every reason to be optimistic about it, because it's time for this. And it's like we have to, in some sense, wake up as a species to what we call, the name we've given ourselves, come to our senses, which is one metaphoric way of even describing mindfulness. You do mindful listening, you do mindful seeing, you do mindful tasting, you do mindful touching, you do, which is inwardly too, awareness of the body and all the different ways that we're now understanding in neuroscience, awareness functions within the body. Mindfulness of communication, of relationships, mindfulness of emotional reactivity, mindfulness of one's own thoughts, as we said. All of these things actually are in the service of integrating oneself as a full human being and a full member of a society of human beings where we appreciate the value of each other. I don't know what could be a more ambitious and at the same time more practical agenda for public education than to create that kind of a foundation for children for a lifelong love of learning, so that this is education and just moves through one's entire life, so to speak, and we never stop learning and we never stop loving it, and then we never stop sharing it with other people. Much of what's going on in the schools now is teaching kids how to work as team members, how to listen to each other, how to cooperate, how to bring your strengths together with your strengths and see what happens, and very often it's more than additive. So mindfulness is the heart of emotional intelligence. And as I said, it affects brain functioning and brain development across the lifespan, actually. So there are almost no liabilities for this kind of thing if the teaching is really well done, and if it's not turned into some kind of romantic idealization, and if there's room also for very, very real feelings. So it's not all about getting the right answer or pretending that, you know, I'm mindful or I'm supposed to be mindful. Now all of a sudden, on top of everything else, I have to be socially acceptable by being mindful. That would be the death knell of it, so to speak. It has to really have an integrity where we can hear from people who are hurting, who are suffering, and who are saying, I have trouble paying attention. And then we meet them where they are. Because, yeah, not everybody is going to, you know, sort of think this is the greatest thing in the world. They're going to think it's silly, or they think it's trivial, or whatever. And so the teaching has to be at a level of skill that is inclusive, so that it doesn't, you know, in some sense, create a caricature of mindfulness as just one more thing that we talk about and sort of fall into lockstep around, but it's its own kind of newspeak. We have to be very, very careful of that. And the more successful and popular it becomes, the more careful we have to become, because then it'll just become one more thing, one more subject that we have to teach to kids, as opposed to a way of being. Mindfulness is really a way of being. It's a quality of heart and mind that we all have by virtue of being human, but that we ignore to a large extent because we're so enamored by thought. Mindfulness or awareness is the only human faculty that I know of that is more powerful, or at least as powerful, as thought and as emotions, because it can hold any thought and it can hold any emotion. That's huge. That's making the assessment right in the present moment. You know, my emotions are arising, I bring a greater awareness to it, and I see I have a choice. I can go the way I always go, bang, or I can choose to do something else, and then see what the outcome of that is. Very often it's a happy outcome where it's not like, well, I wished I'd hit him, but that something wonderful happens. And when you have those branch points or choice points moment by moment by moment, then you begin to navigate in a way that's not self-destructive and navigate in a way that's not others-destructive. These kids are learning this at, you know, age 6, 7, 8. They know it better than we do as adults, because in a sense, we've gotten so much into the conditioning of our own minds that we're caught in our own opinions, we're caught in our own ideas, we're completely imprisoned, so to speak, by our own thought patterns and our own emotional reactivity and our very strongly held opinions that are very hard to change, because we're all about doing, and we've forgotten to be in touch with our own being. Therefore, a lot of the time we feel not only stressed, but miserable, unhappy, because something seems out of joint. Even though we have everything, we may feel like, is it all about this? I mean, is this what life is really about? A lot of the time it's because there's still a distance between who we are, who we know ourselves to be in the deepest of ways, and who we allow ourselves to be. And that distance, very often creates a huge amount of suffering, pain, dissatisfaction, and it can evaporate in a second if we bring awareness to the present moment and learn to drop in and inhabit the only moment we're ever alive in, and to do it with a certain degree of discipline and skill and loving kindness towards ourselves. But it really is a matter of living life as if it really mattered. And that's, it's a practice, it's a discipline. It's not something where, oh yeah, mindfulness, what a great idea. I wish someone had told me that years ago. Just be more present and less judgmental. God, why didn't I think of that? You won't make it to the next, curb if you're walking along the street without losing it. Because it's not a concept, it's not a good idea, it's a way of being, and it requires a certain kind of cultivation. And when we do that kind of cultivation, the body changes, the brain changes, the heart changes, the mind changes, and our relationships, society changes, the community changes, the community of the classroom changes. And people from the outside will say, how come you have such good, classroom behavior? How come you have such good classroom management, right? Well, you're not doing classroom management. What you're doing is you're doing inner listening, and then classroom management is a non-issue, okay? And when you're teaching kids with the bells to really listen, the level of silence that you're getting in many of these classrooms, I think the teachers are astonished by, because they never get that level of silence. It's all already here. All we need to do is, in some sense, take off the blinders and open to it. There's that children's orchestra in Caracas, Venezuela, where they take kids out of the, the poorest regions of the city, and they train them in very, very, to play musical instruments. And they don't turn anybody away, and they really train these kids, and they turn out incredible performances. And the guy who started this orchestra was just hired to be the head of the, Philharmonic in Los Angeles. Also, there are schools in New York City that are doing this kind of thing in the arts. So it's not a matter of mindfulness just being one thing. It can infuse itself into virtually every subject matter. Okay, because if you're present for it, then you can understand it. Anything having to do with dance or movement or even poetry or any kind of recitation, if it's coming out of the whole body, it will be embodied. If it's not coming out of the whole body, where do you think it's coming out of? It's coming out of the head. It never goes well when it's just coming out of the head. So what we need to do is, first of all, with children, the head and the heart are not so separate, so why bother separating them in them? And to the degree that they are, in fact, separated by just the effects of television and the society and the neighborhoods and everything, begin to work to actually bring the head and the heart together. These different forms of intelligence, both of which, and many more, body, are necessary for our ability to really learn and to really function. And my sense is that when kids are exposed to this kind of orientation, they take to it like ducks to water. That this is part of love. It's like an adventure. It's much more interesting than 500 channels of cable television. I mean, it's life unfolding, and the world has changed a lot since I went to school. So now we've got, as I mentioned, all these different distractions. You can play video games. You can watch TV forever. You can you're on your cell phone, you're texting, you're doing all this stuff, all of which in some sense can take you away from the present moment and take you away from yourself. I don't know what I'd do without my cell phone or my laptop or whatever it is. So kind of a reacquaintance program with stillness, with quietude, with the present moment, with nature, with getting away from the digital world and the tyrannies of the digital world, even though many aspects of it are wonderful, but the next generation of children are going to have to learn to live in the digital world in analog bodies and analog minds. And that separation, if it's not attended to, is just going to create very, very disjointed people who are always running around checking one last message. Did I get any messages, or whatever it is, or texting while they're driving, or doing all sorts of things that are just so driven by distraction that we become, in some sense, addicts of stimulation. And that is not a good situation. This is why mindfulness is needed more now than ever, because the more we are speeding up the whole information age and the processing of information and everything, the more that needs to be balanced. So the more we're doing, the more we have to cultivate being. The more we're thinking and emoting, the more we have to cultivate the only power we have that can hold thought and emotion, that can hold thought and emotion and see it for what it is and not be so caught in it that we generate the seeds of our own suffering, despair, and so forth.